The North Atlantic was gray and violent that morning. Cold wind pushed waves across the empty ocean, and a lonely cargo ship moved slowly through the water. To anyone watching from far away, it looked like an ordinary merchant vessel. Rust covered parts of its hull. Smoke rose lazily from its funnel. A few sailors stood on deck, moving boxes and ropes like men who had done the same work every day of their lives. Nothing about the ship looked dangerous. Nothing about it looked important. But several hundred meters below the surface, a German submarine was watching. Inside the narrow steel hull of the submarine, red lights glowed softly over instruments and gauges. The captain leaned over the periscope, studying the cargo ship carefully. Through the narrow lens, he saw exactly what he expected to see in the Atlantic in 1941. Another helpless merchant ship traveling alone. A perfect target. For months, the German submarine fleet had dominated these waters. Allied merchant ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, weapons, steel, and everything Britain needed to survive the war. Without these shipments, the island nation would slowly starve. German commanders understood this perfectly. Their plan was simple: destroy the supply lines. If the ships stopped coming, Britain would collapse. And for a long time, the plan was working. One by one, merchant ships were disappearing beneath the waves. Torpedoes struck without warning. Crews had only seconds to escape before their vessels broke apart and sank into the freezing ocean. Thousands of sailors had already died. The submarine captain watching the cargo ship knew all of this. His orders were clear: sink shipping whenever possible, but conserve torpedoes. Each torpedo was precious. They were difficult to manufacture and impossible to replace once the submarine left port. That meant one thing: if a ship looked weak enough, the captain could surface and destroy it with the deck gun mounted on the submarine's hull. It saved torpedoes, and it made the job easier. The cargo ship ahead looked like the perfect candidate. Slow, poorly defended, and completely alone. The submarine captain made his decision. The order was given quietly. Surface, air rushed through the ballast tanks as the submarine rose from the dark water. Seconds later, the gray shape of the German U-boat broke through the waves. Crew members climbed onto the deck and moved quickly to the gun mounted near the front of the submarine. The merchant ship continued moving slowly across the ocean. It did not change course. It did not increase speed. It looked exactly like a frightened civilian vessel that had not yet realized danger was approaching. The submarine captain watched through binoculars now. He could see a few sailors on the cargo ship's deck. Some of them appeared to notice the submarine. A moment later, chaos seemed to begin. Men started running across the deck. A lifeboat swung outward from the side of the ship. One sailor dropped a bag and hurried back toward the railing. Another climbed down a rope ladder too quickly and nearly fell into the water. From the submarine, the scene looked familiar. The captain had seen it many times before. Merchant crews often panicked when a submarine appeared. They abandoned their ships quickly, hoping the Germans would allow them to escape before sinking the vessel. The submarine continued moving closer. The distance shrank. 1,500 yards, 1,200 yards, 800 yards. The German gun crew prepared their weapon. A shell slid into the breech of the deck gun with a metallic click. The submarine captain lowered his binoculars slightly, satisfied that the cargo ship posed no threat. This would be an easy kill. The first shell would strike the hull near the waterline. The next few shots would finish the job. Within minutes, the ship would sink, and the submarine would disappear beneath the ocean once again. But something about the merchant ship was not quite right. The sailors in the lifeboat were not rowing away. They remained strangely close to the vessel. Another sailor appeared on deck, looking back toward the submarine. For a fraction of a second, the German captain felt a small sense of uncertainty. Then everything happened at once. Panels along the side of the cargo ship suddenly collapsed downward. What had looked like simple wooden walls dropped flat against the deck. Behind them, heavy naval guns were waiting. The illusion vanished in a single heartbeat. The harmless cargo ship transformed into a warship. Flashes of fire exploded from the hidden guns. The first shells struck the submarine's conning tower with terrifying force. Metal shattered. Men were thrown across the deck. The German gun crew never had time to fire their weapon. More shells slammed into the submarine's hull. Water erupted around the vessel as steel plates split open under the impact. The submarine tried to dive, but it was already too late. Damage spread through the hull in seconds. Cold Atlantic water rushed inside. Cold Atlantic water rushed inside. Within minutes, the submarine began to sink. Oil spread across the surface of the sea. Debris floated between the waves, and the cargo ship, the helpless merchant vessel that had seemed so vulnerable only moments earlier, remained floating above the destruction because it had never been a normal merchant ship. It was something entirely different. It was a trap. And ships like this had a name. They were called Q-ships. To understand why these strange vessels existed, you have to understand how desperate the situation in the Atlantic had become. By the early years of the Second World War, German submarines had turned the Atlantic Ocean into a killing ground. Merchant ships carrying vital supplies were being destroyed faster than the Allies could replace them. Entire convoys vanished into the sea. Food shipments disappeared. Oil tankers exploded in massive fires that burned across the surface of the water. The scale of the disaster was enormous. Between the beginning of the war and the middle of 1943, German submarines destroyed thousands of Allied ships. Tens of thousands of sailors lost their lives in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Britain was an island nation. That meant everything depended on shipping. If the ships stopped arriving, the country would run out of food, fuel, and raw materials within months. Factories would close, armies would weaken, the war effort would collapse. Even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who stood strong during the bombing of London, later admitted that the submarine threat was the one thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Bombs falling on cities were terrifying, but submarines attacking shipping lanes could quietly strangle a nation. German naval commander Karl Dönitz understood this better than anyone. He commanded the German submarine fleet and believed completely in a strategy known as the Wolf Pack. Groups of submarines would spread across the Atlantic, waiting for convoys of merchant ships. When one submarine spotted a convoy, it would signal the others. Soon, several submarines would attack at once. The convoys were often protected by only a few escort ships. The submarines slipped between them. Torpedoes struck from the darkness, and ships began to sink, night after night, month after month. The Royal Navy needed a solution. But the Atlantic Ocean was enormous. Escort ships were limited. Aircraft could only patrol so far from land, and early radar systems were still primitive. German submarines had too many advantages. But there was one weakness in the submarine strategy, and a British naval officer named Gordon Campbell understood it better than almost anyone. Campbell had already fought submarines once before. During the First World War, he had commanded strange vessels designed for a very unusual purpose. These ships were disguised to look weak and defenseless, but they carried hidden weapons. Their job was to trick enemy submarines. The idea was simple, but dangerous. Pretend to be an easy target, wait for the submarine to surface, then attack before it could escape. It was an idea that sounded almost insane, but Campbell had used it successfully before. Now, decades later, the Atlantic War was becoming desperate again, and Campbell believed the old idea might work once more. Convincing the Royal Navy would not be easy. Many senior officers believed the concept was outdated. German submarine captains already knew about deception ships from the previous war. They would surely be cautious now. Why risk men and ships on a strategy that might fail? Campbell's answer was simple. Knowledge did not always create caution. Confidence could make commanders careless. German submarines had been winning for so long that many captains believed merchant ships posed no threat at all. That confidence created an opportunity, and Campbell intended to use it. Soon, ordinary cargo ships were quietly taken into secret shipyards in Britain. Workers began transforming them into something entirely different. Heavy naval guns were hidden behind wooden panels that could drop open in seconds. Automatic cannons were concealed inside fake ventilation structures. Depth charges were hidden beneath removable deck plates. From the outside, the ships still looked harmless. Inside, they were heavily armed. But the weapons were only part of the illusion. The crews also had to perform a carefully planned deception. When a submarine approached, selected sailors would act like frightened civilians abandoning ship. They would rush toward lifeboats, shout at each other, and pretend to panic. From the submarine, everything would look normal. But hidden below deck, trained gunners would wait in silence, watching, timing the moment, waiting until the submarine came close enough that it could not escape. Then the disguise would fall, and the trap would close. It was an extremely dangerous strategy. Because if the submarine fired a torpedo first, the Q-ship would have no chance to fight back. The ship would explode, and the crew would almost certainly die. Every man who joined a Q-ship crew understood this risk, yet volunteers still came forward. They sailed into the most dangerous ocean in the world, pretending to be helpless targets, waiting for the enemy to attack, and hoping that when the moment came they would reveal their guns before the submarine destroyed them. The first missions were quiet. Days passed without contact. The ships drifted across empty gray water. The crews waited in cramped, hidden compartments, and somewhere beneath the surface of the Atlantic, German submarines continued their hunt. Eventually, the hunters and the traps would meet, and when they did, the Battle of the Atlantic would begin to change in ways no one had expected. But the Germans would not remain fooled forever. Soon they would begin to adapt. Soon the Q-ships themselves would become targets, and the men sailing them would discover just how deadly the Atlantic Ocean could truly be. The most dangerous phase of the Q-ship war had not even begun yet, and when it did, both sides would learn that deception in war can be just as deadly as any weapon. For a short time, the trap worked perfectly. German submarine captains continued doing what they had done for months. When they saw a lone merchant ship traveling slowly across the Atlantic, they surfaced and used their deck guns. And sometimes, without warning, those harmless ships suddenly opened fire. The first few submarine losses confused German naval command. Some boats vanished without sending distress signals. Others disappeared in areas where no Allied warships had been reported. Something unusual was happening in the Atlantic. At first, German intelligence officers believed the submarines had simply encountered better escort ships. But the reports coming back from surviving crews told a different story. Some submariners described merchant ships that suddenly revealed hidden guns. Ships that were supposed to be defenseless had turned into warships. The Germans realized what they were facing. The British had revived an old and dangerous idea. The Q-ship was back. And once German commanders understood this, everything began to change. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, studied the reports carefully. Dönitz was not a careless commander. He believed deeply in analyzing every success and every failure. When submarines were lost, he wanted to know why. The pattern soon became clear. Submarines that surfaced near isolated merchant ships sometimes disappeared shortly afterward. Dönitz quickly issued new instructions to his commanders. Be cautious when approaching lone ships. Watch carefully for unusual behavior. If something seems wrong, attack from a distance. For the Q-ship crews, this change was dangerous. The entire strategy depended on submarines coming close enough to attack with their deck guns. If submarines began using torpedoes instead, the deception would fail instantly. A torpedo fired from underwater could destroy a merchant ship before its crew even knew a submarine was nearby. And unfortunately, that is exactly what began happening. One cold morning in early 1942, a Q-ship was patrolling, west of Ireland. The crew had spent days waiting. Nothing had appeared on the horizon. The ocean seemed empty. Then suddenly, a violent explosion ripped through the side of the ship. A torpedo had struck the hull without warning. The blast tore open the engine room. Water flooded inside almost instantly. There had been no chance to deploy the trap, no chance to reveal the hidden guns. Within minutes, the ship began to sink. Sailors jumped into the freezing water as the vessel disappeared beneath the waves. Many of them never made it to the lifeboats. For the men who operated Q-ships, this became the new reality. Sometimes the trap worked. Sometimes the submarine was fooled. But sometimes the submarine captain never surfaced at all. And in those moments, the Q-ship crews were simply sailors aboard fragile merchant vessels, facing torpedoes that could destroy them in seconds. Losses began to increase. Inside the British Admiralty, some officers began questioning the entire program. The ships were expensive to convert. The missions were extremely dangerous, and the results were difficult to measure. Yes, some submarines had been destroyed, but many Q-ships spent weeks at sea without encountering a single enemy vessel. Was the strategy worth the risk? Commander Gordon Campbell believed the answer was still yes. He argued that the real impact of the Q-ships could not be measured only by submarines destroyed. Their true weapon was doubt. Every time a submarine captain hesitated before approaching a merchant ship, every time he wasted a torpedo on a target that might be a trap, the British gained an advantage. The war in the Atlantic was a war of mathematics. If submarines wasted torpedoes, they would sink fewer ships. If they hesitated, convoys would survive. But Campbell needed proof, and proof arrived in the form of an engagement that would become one of the most remarkable encounters of the entire Q-ship campaign. The morning sky over the Atlantic was pale gray when the lookout spotted something unusual. Two dark shapes were visible on the horizon. Submarines. They were traveling on the surface, moving in the same direction. For a moment, the crew of the disguised Q-ship simply watched. Two submarines meant twice the danger. If either captain became suspicious, the ship could be destroyed instantly. The commander of the Q-ship considered his options carefully. Running away would reveal fear, and fear might cause the submarines to attack immediately. Instead, he chose a far riskier strategy. He ordered the ship to turn directly toward the nearest submarine. To the Germans, it would look like a careless merchant vessel that had not yet noticed the danger. The gamble worked. The nearest submarine surfaced completely and began preparing its stack gun. From the submarine captain's perspective, the situation looked perfect. A slow cargo ship, traveling alone, moving directly toward him. It looked like an easy target. The submarine moved closer. At first, nothing happened. Then the familiar scene began playing out on the deck of the Q-ship. Men started running. A lifeboat swung outward. One sailor appeared to trip and fall near the railing. Another shouted something that could not be heard over the wind. From the submarine, it looked like panic. The captain watched the chaos through binoculars. Satisfied, he ordered his gun crew to fire a warning shot. The shell flew across the water and splashed ahead of the ship. The cargo vessels slowed even more. The distance between them continued shrinking. 800 yards, 700 yards, 600 yards. The submarine was now dangerously close. Inside the hidden compartments of the Q-ship, British gunners waited silently. They had practiced this moment many times, but in reality it always felt different. The slightest mistake could mean death. Finally, the commander gave the order, "Drop the panels." In an instant, the disguise vanished. Wooden walls collapsed. Naval guns appeared. The first volley of shells exploded from the ship. The submarine's deck gun crew never had time to react. Shells slammed into the conning tower. Metal fragments tore across the deck. The submarine tried to dive, but the damage was already too severe. Within minutes, it began sinking. But the battle was not over. The second submarine had seen everything. The moment the Q-ship revealed its guns, the second captain understood the trap. He ordered an emergency dive. Water rushed over the hull as the submarine disappeared beneath the surface. The Q-ship's guns fired rapidly, trying to hit the vessel before it vanished. Several shells struck near the conning tower. Then the submarine disappeared underwater. The commander of the Q-ship immediately ordered depth charges launched. Explosions shook the ocean. Columns of water rose into the air. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then oil began spreading across the surface. Moments later, the damaged submarine rose slowly from beneath the waves. Its crew climbed onto the deck, raising their hands. They could not dive again. The submarine had been crippled. In a single engagement, the Q-ship had defeated 2 German submarines. One was destroyed, the other surrendered. It was one of the greatest successes of the entire deception program, but the consequences would reach far beyond that single battle. When German Naval Command learned what had happened, the reaction was immediate. New orders were issued across the entire submarine fleet. From that moment forward, any lone merchant ship could be considered a trap. Submarine commanders were authorized to fire torpedoes first. Questions could be asked later. This change had a massive impact. Submarines began UCI, no torpedoes against smaller targets. They attacked from greater distances. They hesitated before approaching ships on the surface, and every torpedo wasted on a suspicious merchant vessel was a torpedo that could not be used against an Allied convoy. Slowly, the balance in the Atlantic began to shift. The Q-ships had not destroyed dozens of submarines, but they had planted something far more powerful inside the minds of German commanders. Doubt, and doubt is one of the most dangerous weapons in war. But the Q-ship crews would soon discover that success brought its own problems. The Germans were learning, they were adapting, and the next phase of the war would become even more deadly for the men sailing these disguised ships. Because once The enemy knows a trap exists. The trap can also become the target. By the middle of 1942, the strange ships, sailing quietly through the Atlantic, had already changed the war in ways most people never understood. They had not destroyed dozens of submarines. They had not won spectacular naval battles. Instead, they had done something far more subtle. They had forced the enemy to hesitate. German submarine captains who once attacked merchant ships with complete confidence now approached every target with suspicion. Every lonely cargo vessel on the horizon might be a trap. Every harmless-looking ship might suddenly reveal hidden guns. This uncertainty spread slowly through the submarine fleet, and the effect was real. Submarines began firing more torpedoes at smaller targets. They attacked from greater distances. Some captains refused to surface at all when they saw a merchant vessel sailing alone. Each small change seemed insignificant on its own, but together, those changes altered the entire rhythm of the Atlantic War. Convoys that might once have been attacked aggressively were sometimes missed. Submarines wasted precious torqued on ships that were not worth the cost. And occasionally, when a submarine hesitated for even a few minutes, an escort destroyer or patrol aircraft arrived just in time to prevent disaster. The Q ships had introduced something new into the ocean. Fear, not the fear of destruction, but the fear of uncertainty. Yet even as their influence grew, the situation for the Q ship crews themselves was becoming more dangerous than ever before. German commanders had begun issuing strict warnings about deception vessels. Submarine captains were told to watch for suspicious behavior. They were instructed to observe lifeboats carefully. If the crew of a merchant ship stayed too close to their vessel after abandoning it, that could mean a trap. Some submarines now attacked without any warning at all. A torpedo fired from underwater gave a Q ship almost no chance to defend itself, and several ships were lost exactly that way. One patrol ended in tragedy when a disguised vessel sailing west of the Bay of Biscay was struck by 2 torpedoes within seconds. The explosions tore the hull apart so violently that the crew barely had time to launch lifeboats. Many of the men disappeared with the ship. Others survived in the freezing water until rescue arrived hours later. Stories like this rarely appeared in newspapers. The missions were secret. Even the families of the sailors often believed their relatives served on ordinary merchant vessels. Inside the British Admiralty, debates began again. Some officers argued that the deception program had achieved its goal. Submarine behavior had already changed. Continuing the program might only risk more lives. Others believed the Q ships should remain active as long as possible. As long as the threat existed, the doubt in German minds would remain. But events outside the Q ship program were beginning to reshape the entire Battle of the Atlantic. New technologies were appearing. Long-range patrol aircraft were closing the enormous gap in the middle of the ocean, where submarines had once operated freely. Escort carriers began traveling with convoys, launching fighter planes that could search for submarines across vast distances. Radar systems improved dramatically. For the first time, Allied ships could detect submarines on the surface at night. Even more important was something the German Navy did not fully realize at the time. British codebreakers had begun reading secret German communications. Messages sent by submarine commanders were being intercepted and decoded. Convoys could now be redirected away from danger. Hunter groups could be sent directly toward submarine positions. Slowly but steadily, the balance of power in the Atlantic began shifting. Submarines were still dangerous, but they were no longer invincible. By early 1943, the situation had reached a turning point. German losses were rising sharply. More submarines were being destroyed than ever before, and Allied leaders began asking a difficult question. Did the Q-ship program still serve a useful purpose? The answer was not simple. Commander Gordon Campbell believed strongly that it did. He argued that the psychological effect of the Q-ships remained important. German captains were still cautious around lone merchant vessels. If the deception ships disappeared completely, that fear might eventually fade. But the Admiralty had to consider other priorities. The ships used as Q ships could return to normal merchant service, carrying desperately needed cargo. The crews could reinforce escort groups, fighting submarines directly. Resources were limited, and new technology was now doing much of the work that deception ships had once performed. In March 1943, the decision was made. The Q-ship program would quietly end. Orders were sent to the remaining Vessels returned to port, remove the hidden weapons, restore the ships to their normal appearance. The strange chapter of naval warfare was closing. For the crews who had sailed those ships, the end came quietly. There were no victory parades, no newspaper headlines. Most of the missions remained classified. The men simply returned to other duties in the Navy or the merchant fleet. Some continued fighting in escort groups chasing submarines across the Atlantic. Others returned to civilian shipping after the war ended. Many never spoke about what they had done. For decades, the story of the Q ships remained hidden inside sealed military archives. Historians knew small pieces of the story, but the full picture did not emerge until years later, when secret documents were finally released. When researchers studied those records, they discovered something remarkable. The Q ships had destroyed only a limited number of submarines directly, but the real impact of the program was measured in behavior. German commanders had changed the way they fought because of those deceptive ships. Submarines wasted torpedoes on targets that once would have been destroyed with gunfire. Captains hesitated before approaching vessels that looked suspicious. In a war where supply lines determined survival, those small changes saved lives. Historians later estimated that the disruption caused by Q ships helped protect thousands of sailors and cargo vessels during the most dangerous years of the Atlantic War. And the idea itself did not disappear. Long after the Second World War ended, naval strategists continued studying the concept of deception at sea. Disguised vessels, hidden weapons, and psychological tactics remained part of military planning. The principle was simple. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not the one that destroys the enemy. Sometimes it is the one that forces the enemy. Sometimes it is the one that forces the enemy doubt what he sees. Commander Gordon Campbell never became famous for rebuilding the Q ship program. Frederick John Walker, the brilliant anti-submarine tactician who helped refine the strategy, would later become one of the most successful submarine hunters of the entire war. And the sailors who served aboard those disguised ships returned to ordinary lives after the conflict ended. Many of their neighbors never knew the truth. They had sailed across one of the most dangerous oceans in history, pretending to be helpless targets while waiting for submarines to come close enough to fight. Some never returned. Others carried the secret with them for the rest of their lives. Yet their strange mission left a quiet mark on the history of the Atlantic War. Because, in the vast gray waters between Europe and America, a handful of ordinary cargo ships had become something far more dangerous than anyone expected. They had become ghosts, ships that were not what they appeared to be. Ships that forced an entire submarine fleet to wonder whether the next easy target might suddenly open fire. And sometimes, that single moment of doubt was enough to change the outcome of a battle. History often remembers the largest fleets, the most powerful battleships, and the most famous admirals. But sometimes the war is shaped by something smaller. A strange idea, a risky plan, a handful of volunteers willing to sail into danger and pretend to be weak. And in the dark years of the Second World War, those ships quietly helped keep the Atlantic alive.